I thought about doing this slideshow a long time ago when I was finding out that all these recordings were so different. And they sounded different. And the biggest difference in the recordings that I found out was the bass. And I also found out that, like, right when CDs started, maybe early 80s, those seemed to be the worst recordings out there. It seemed harsh, aggressive. It was kind of before they perfected things. Let me get my laser pointer. So what I did is put a slide up. The first slide is, and it really is amazing that we can get our high-end audio system to do a decent job with how different recordings are engineered. So I want to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things today. And each of these things will kind of come to the point of what I'm talking about. I'm sure that, I don't know, I'm not sure, but I think that everyone has heard about the circle of confusion by Floyd Toole. It's out there and it's very true about how all the recording places record are all different, and the speakers are different, and all the things to make a recording that's why all the recordings sound different. We're going to talk about bad monitor speakers used to create a recording. Mike Chafee, I'm sure you've heard of the Yamaha NS10s.
Oh yeah.
The loudness wars, which is a loss of dynamic range. Bob Katz always talks about this. In fact, he talked about this when Mike Chafee invited him to our meeting at Mike's house. Very, very interesting. Francis Rumsey, who's a really good speaker, and you should probably listen to his YouTube presentation. He talks about how Lexicon processes ambience in 95% of the recordings, including classical recordings. They're not real ambience. People think they are, but they're not. And then the last thing is major studio DSP processing in the studio. You can't get around it. It happens all the time. So if you don't like DSP, then you have a problem, because almost every recording is using DSP to process it. I happen to like DSP, so it doesn't bother me. And also there's a case for tone controls, whether it's bass or treble, to make the recording sound up to par. So here's what I put on last time. It's just my qualifications, which I'm not an engineer, never worked for a recording studio, never worked for a hi-fi company, although I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So I've been doing DIY audio since the 70s. Mike Chafee sold me my first KEF kit back in like 77 or something like that with Bruce Newman. Remember that, Mike?
Oh yes.
I've been a speaker builder since the 70s, tried every different type of design, I think. Vented, sealed, dipole, all different types of designs. I've always been interested in the reason why one audio component sounds better than another. But I am willing to try unorthodox different things to try to improve the sound. So I'm not always stuck on how things are done. I always look for another way, because I just think there is another way. So we'll talk about Dr. Floyd Toole. He is an impressive business academic credentials, having held the position of corporate vice president, acoustical engineer at Harman International from 1991 until he retired in 2007, senior research officer in the acoustics and signal processing group at National Research Council of Canada. He talks about the circle of confusion. Circle of confusion is pretty straightforward. We could start with any part of the circle, and we come up with the all the way around the circle, and we end up with different sounding recordings. So we'll start with number one: microphones equalization, ambience, and other effects. Evaluate using monitor loudspeakers, which are all different and have different frequency response and play differently into the room, that are evaluated using recordings that are used as test signals to subjectively evaluate loudspeakers. So you're using one loudspeaker to evaluate your loudspeaker at home. Now, these are used in consumers to put into homes, which we're mainly concerned about, but don't forget, they go into automobiles also. So they have they have to be different and louder to go into an automobile because you don't want to hear the road noise. So a lot of times they're recorded louder for automobiles, and then and also for headphones. So you're trying to make a recording sound good in all three of these places. It's very hard: homes, automobiles, and headphones. So you have this circle of confusion. It is a confusion. Does anyone want to, AJ, you want to talk about that a little bit?
No, I mean, it's spelled out right there. That's where a lot of confusion is that people are judging things based on recordings that are made by people who don't have an absolute standard. There is no standard of recording, and there is no standard of playback, because there's a room, there's a car, and there's a headphone. So there's no reference standard for the playback, and there's no reference standard for the recording, and so round and round we go. But of course, I think that paradigm that we're in right there is stereo. Let's not confuse it now. It is stereo. There are recording techniques outside of stereo that are very specifically for a type of environment and a type of playback. But stereo that we all have and listen to every day, this is it right here.
But the stereo usually is divided into homes, automobiles, and mobile. The 5.1 recordings and all that usually aren't, you don't use them here. You mainly use them in homes, correct?
No, actually, a lot of cars now have 5.1. They have
really?
what? Yeah, oh yes, oh that's where the big money
Yes.
is. Harman is kind of almost out of the home. Excuse me, Harman Kardon is almost out of the home audio business. But heavily into cars with the surround sound system, especially the premium vehicles. And then there is, for headphones, for gaming, etc., there is what we would consider almost like multi-channel, where spatial objects are placed and all that sort of thing for gaming. So those are big industries right now, completely outside the realm of home stereo audio, which a lot of people don't know about.
Interesting.
If I can interject, I've got a quick question, guys. Sorry. Has the Audio Engineering Society ever tried to come up with a standard, propose a standard for stereo?
What do you mean a standard?
For stereo?
Yeah, for stereo recordings, a standard, just like they'd have now for Atmos, Dolby. They have a lot of standards, but not for two-channel.
No, you can't have a standard for stereo, because stereo only captures about 10 or 20% of an entire sound field. So you can't have a standard for something that only captures a tiny fraction of a real sound field. So stereo is just a solution for movies back in the 1930s, when Alan Blumlein was sitting in a theater and he wanted the sound to follow the actor versus it being anchored over on one set of speakers, and he came up with stereo. And so stereo's always been a highly compromised medium, but of course we've developed it so much now that and people have gotten so used to it that they think that is actually the reference standard for what things should sound like. And the unfortunate reality is that people often judge stereo systems based on what they think a stereo system should sound like versus what a concert hall or you know, what you imagine a recording should have sounded like.
But I think the goals here, you're trying to have them have a recording sound good in your home and in an automobile, which a lot of times has to be louder, and you lose dynamic range as soon as you make it for an automobile. And then you're trying to make the same recording sound good for mobile. That's the issue. Is the goal is to sell as many recordings.
I'd like to make an observation if
Sure.
my voice holds up. I did back when I was a Lexicon rep, I did a seminar at Full Sail with Eddie Kramer, world famous engineer, and I asked him, when you do your monitoring, do you use a world-class monitor? Is that what you do? He said, I use a world-class monitor, and I double check it on a well-known boombox to make sure I haven't made any mistakes.
This
That's
is Gary.
great.
I have a comment about the circle. Hello?
Yes.
Go ahead, Gary.
Gary, I have a comment about the circle. From my recording experience, I might substitute microphones for monitor loudspeakers because I make entire recordings without using monitor loudspeakers. When I'm in the hall doing the recording, I don't have a back room with a bunch of monitor speakers in it, monitoring what my mics are hearing. I just take a guess as to the field of coverage of the particular microphone array, and then I record it. I make sure the gain is right and everything like that. And then when I get home, I'm editing on my computer with my computer monitor speakers, and I don't change anything with reference to the speakers. I only make sure that the gain and the mix are correct. Then I take the final result out to the big listening room and listen to it. And it sounds great when you don't mess with anything. When I try to equalize, it messes it up, and I don't like it.
95.
In the car, it's not loud enough. It never is loud enough on a boombox or a car or a non-hi-fi system. So I try to make the gain as high as possible while I'm mixing, and hoping for the best when they get it in their cars.
95% of the recording engineers don't do it your way, though. They do not do it your way. And I'll go into that in a little bit.
You know, I want to make a comment, John, about my conversation with Bob Katz. Actually, two comments. I asked him what speaker he used that he preferred in the studio, and I think he mentioned PMCs. Now, there's two English brands, PMCs and ATCs, that really monopolize like 90% of the studios as far as the speakers that they use. So I would think that those two brands of speakers, I'm generalizing, of course, but I'm assuming that those two types of speakers would influence all the speakers that we have at home, because if that's what's used as the benchmark, the sound of those speakers would then influence how we need to manipulate our systems to bring as much of the realism of the recording as we can into our homes.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's the first thing. Another observation was recently I was in Sam Ash buying some recording equipment, and if you look at the studio speakers that they have for recording studios, most of them are pure junk. Most of them are real garbage speakers. They're small, and they're meant to fit on a table or some kind of recording table with a mixer on it. And if those are what's being used, and we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on hi-fi equipment, and they're mixing these things with, you know, with $100 a piece speakers. So
that's the point of this whole thing, the pristine audio recording or not.
Right.
Well, what I'm trying to tell you is you don't need to depend on monitor speakers while you're doing a mix. You can just use good microphones, do the mix, and not equalize it to your crummy speakers, and you'll do a lot better.
Well, I want to throw out a question that doesn't need an answer right now, but maybe it's something we could all think about. As I do some recording, the second process in the recording is the mixing, and the third process of the recording is the mastering. Now, my mixing and mastering are based on the limits of the recording equipment that I'm using. Recording equipment that I'm using allows you to change just certain parts or certain aspects of the recording and they call it mixing. And then when you get into mastering, they allow you to change other aspects of the recording. I am not really sure what the difference is between mixing and mastering. And that's something I think that needs to be honed. And I think when you're listening to speakers, from what I always knew, that it really is the mastering part of the recording that you need to rely on the equipment that's being used in the studio. And I'm not really so sure how much influence the recording engineer has when he walks into a studio. I mean, what's there is there. Now, what he prefers is one thing, but whoever puts the studio together, that's the equipment that's there.
Joe, mixing is because studios typically have, you know, a vocals chamber, a drum room, and they take all these various tracks and then you put it all together. You mix it. That's the mixing part of recordings. The mastering part is when that's all been done, you know, done down into a stereo track. Now you've got all these multi tracks and you've mixed it into a hodgepodge of what you're calling stereo. Then the final outtake, if you want to call it, is the mastering of that mixed down stereo track.
All right, but you get to the point where when you're talking about mixing, what you just said now would come to me as, okay, you're setting levels when you're mixing. You're making sure that the piano isn't too loud, that the drums aren't dominating the vocals, that type of thing. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. I mean, where in space you want to put that track. Let's say it's a 13-track recording or a 20-track recording. Where you put that, are you putting it on the right, or you're putting it on the left? What do you know, I think there's a little bit more to it than that, mixing. I understand what you're saying. You're mixing singular tracks together as if now you got a single performance, okay? Which would assume that if you're recording live, if you're recording in a studio live, you really don't need to do any mixing because you're only using 2 microphones or 4 microphones or whatever that is. So you're reducing.
You're always always adding reverb and ambience. Almost all the recordings have that.
Right, but that's the mastering part, I would think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but 99% of recordings is not a performance, like a live performance, like a concert. It's a piecemeal singer here. It could be in another country. The singer can be singing in another country, and they get the vocal track, and then they send it over, and then you mix it with the guitar track to the guys here, and then the drum. So that part of it is the mixing. And I mean, I'm by no means a recording pro, but I know that part of the mix of it is the mixing, because I've been to what's that guy's name? John Chafee knows him too, over in Orlando with the studio.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's a good guy.
I'm having a brain freeze here. Anyway, so I've been to his studio a couple times and saw how it was all done, and it's really educational and enlightening to see how, like I said, there is a vocal booth. Nobody else is. The band isn't in there. It's just the guy doing or girl.
And that's why they have to add ambience too, because the vocal booth has no room feel to it. So then you have to add ambience, or it's going to sound flat. So you have to do it.
Right. So you might go back during the mastering and do a bit of remixing and say, you know, hey, I need to remix this a little bit different, and then send it back to the master, because now you've added a bit more ambience to the vocals.
The question becomes, is that what you want to hear, what the engineer, because sometimes the engineer doesn't do that great of a job on it. So, and my point is you should have some type of a choice of what you want to listen to, not what the engineer wants you to listen to.
Well, you know, Alan's point is well taken too with the standard, because how many of us listen to a stereo recording and the lead vocal is right in the middle, let's say for argument's sake, and the background vocals are on the left channel. And then you'll get another recording and the lead vocal is completely on the right channel. And maybe you won't like it there, you know, but like Alan said, if there was a standard that we could say, okay, the main vocal is always going to be right in the center channel, we would have something to judge our speaker with. Because soon as I get that singer right in the middle, then the next recording comes on and my system is all off again, and I'm back.
You cannot standardize artistic intent. That's the problem.
Or better yet, you can't use recordings of music to standardize your stereo. You have to use test tracks. So that's why I have the Sheffield test track, because I know that the in phase is dead center, and I know that the out of phase is pulled out of the speakers, and I know, you know, the test. So you have to use test signals to make sure your speakers and everything else are set up right. And then the recordings are whatever the recordings are.
You know, one thing I've talked about doing, and I've been lax and not doing it myself, is we should come up with our own series of test tracks. I've got some I've created that are excerpts that we all use to agree that that will be a reference for the club. And when we have a listening session, hopefully you just have excerpts so it's no longer than 4 minutes long. And you start off every meeting listening to it, so we have the exact same tracks we're listening to on multiple systems.
That's a great
AJ
idea.
has already done that, and I made a master of it with labels and everything.
I think that was just kind of a demo, you know, music CD, Gary, rather than any sort of reference standard. Unless you're intimately familiar with the music, which I guess if you played it enough, you would be, so that you would know that the drums start out on the left side. And so that's how I can tell. A lot of times we've had meets, and I'll quickly tell somebody their system is out of phase or the channels are reversed, because you play something that you know that starts out on the left side or starts out on the right side, and they're reversed, and you go, whoops. Or I can instantly hear things out of phase or in phase. So yes, you would have to have tracks geared specifically for that, which mine really aren't, but could be if needed.
Well, there's Sheffield Lab, but there's also stereophile discs that will do that. And I have all that stuff, and it does come in handy, no doubt about it.
Yeah,
Does anyone have any more comments on this slide here before I go on?
I'd like to make a comment about mastering. There are mastering engineers who will only take well-done recordings. Doug Sachs, Bob Ludwig, they will not do rescue mastering. Whereas Alan Silverman, Bob Katz will do rescue mastering.
Interesting. Okay, we okay with the slide?
And one last thing about Bob Katz, I thought I heard Joe say something about PMC. He uses Dyne Audio now, and he used to have the Revels before that.
Well,
And that's what he uses.
That's what he owns. But I asked him what speakers does he prefer in the studio. He said he owned Dyne Audio. But what my specific question was, what speakers do you see in studios? What are prevalent in the studio, and what do you use mostly? And he said PMCs.
You see PMCs, you see ATCs, they're both great. You see a lot of Genelec.
Genelec, yeah, Genelec, JBLs. I've seen a lot of other brands other
Yamaha
than PMC.
NS10, one of the most famous mixing speaker ever.
Absolutely. It wasn't PMC. It was the Yamaha NS10. They're still in studios.
Yeah,
I can tell you guys why, if you like. I did a studio down in the Bahamas, and their main engineer was a Bryson 4B and NS10 kind of guy. I knew if I didn't make this thing sound right, it wasn't going to be happy. So I made him happy. He said he used NS10s because you live in the mid-range. You have to work real hard, and if you get the mid-range right on the NS10, you're probably going in the right direction. Till that, then I did not understand it all.
but the problem is the NS10 has a 5 dB peak at 2K. So if the engineer is going to equalize that, and then you're going to play it back on your beautiful flat recording, you're going to be missing that 2K. That's the issue.
It's experience. Then it boils down to experience. Guys like Bob Clearmountain, who's one of the finest mixers ever, uses NS10s.
John, you should just flip to the next page of Tool's book. The NS10 is probably on there, so it's not far after. No, I was kidding, but he talks about the NS10 and shows the frequency response, etc.
So here's the circle of confusion. It's a term coined by Floyd Toole. Describes confusion that exists within audio recording and reproduction chain to the lack of a standardized, calibrated monitoring environment. Music recordings are made with exactly what we said, so we don't have to review that again. Listening to professional monitors, he really doesn't let's talk about the room here, but the room that the recording's done in is a huge thing too. It's not only the speaker, the room is huge. Both the creation of the art, the recording, and its reproduction, the loudspeaker and room are trapped, there it is, are trapped in an interdependent circular relationship where the quality of one is dependent on the quality of another. Since the playback chain and room through which recordings are monitored are not standardized, the quality of the recording remains highly variable. So here we go. A random sampling of one's own music library will quickly confirm the variation in sound equality that exists among different music recordings. Apart from the audible differences in dynamic range, spatial imagery, and noise and distortion, the spectral balance, this is important, of the recordings can vary dramatically in terms of their brightness and particularly the quality and quantity of bass. And that's true. I mean, there are so many recordings, and thank God that I have the ability to increase the bass, because there's some recordings that are so bass shy that I really wouldn't want to listen to them. And if you recall in my last slideshow, one of my major goals is to be able to listen to 80% of my recordings. So therefore, I have to alter those recordings just a little bit. I don't sit there and go crazy with the EQ, and every recording's, you know, not different for playback. But I will just get general filters that I'll improve these recordings so at least they're listenable. The magnitude of these differences suggests that something other than variations in artistic judgment and good taste is at the root of the cause of the problem. Most likely culprits are the loudspeakers in rooms through which recordings were made. While there are many excellent professional near-field monitors in the marketplace today, there are no industry guidelines or standards to ensure that they are used. The lack of meaningful, perceptually relevant loudspeakers makes the excellent loudspeaker difficult to identify and separate from the truly mediocre one. To make matters worse, some misguided recording engineers monitor and tweak their recordings through low-fidelity loudspeakers, thinking that this represents what the average consumer will hear. Since loudspeakers can be mediocre in an infinite number of ways, this practice only guarantees that the quality of the recording will be compromised when heard through, can't see, loudspeakers. This is very counterproductive. We want to improve the quality and consistency of the audio recording and reproduction. Here it is, the famous Yamaha NS10. And it was made from 1978 to 2001. Like AJ said, they're still in some studios, and so they're 20 years old. Love or hate them, the Yamaha NS10, this unassuming little speaker has found a place in the studios of many of the world's top producers. We trace its history and investigate why a monitor, this is sound on sound, by the way, why a monitor whose sound has been described as horrible became an industry standard. Now, it has a 5 decibel boost in the mid-range at around 2K. Your ears are more sensitive to sound right at 2K, 1500 2K. So they're mixing with this, and your other speakers that you're playing hopefully have more of a flat response. So you're either causing a suck out or aggression or different things because you're monitoring and trying to alter the recording based on this speaker. The bottom end starts rolling off at 200 hertz. That's incredible, because that's why a lot of times you need bass boost or else you can't really listen to the recording. So think about this. You have a peak at 2K. That makes it aggressive. Now you roll off the bass at 200 hertz. That makes it aggressive. So then you wonder why there's so many aggressive recordings out there. Recording studios around the world, particularly those specializing in rock and pop music, adopted the speaker as a standard. In excess of 200,000 pairs were sold throughout the world. Gizmodo referred to it as the most important loudspeaker you never heard of. I think that's great.
So why wouldn't you would think a professional recording engineer would be aware of this?
They are, but it's kind of, you're right there, but it's kind of not their fault. They're doing the best they can. But the problem is, it doesn't, these speakers don't sound good. If you had these in your house, you'd run from them. You're right, Craig. Absolutely.
No, I thought the idea was that they would do their mix on the main studio monitors, but they would make sure to play it on the Yamaha NS10 so that they get a good idea of how it sounds on crappy consumer speakers, just so that something doesn't take them by surprise. Because if everybody used these as the primary monitoring monitors, you should see a lot of bass boost in all the recordings, right? You don't see that.
Well, yeah.
Most main speakers in studios suck. They don't image worth of shit. They have no front to back. So the first time they put these up and used them near field, they heard a dimension that they had never heard before in their recordings.
Well, if they're rolling off at 200 hertz, they don't even know what's going on below 200 hertz. It's a guessing game.
You're right.
Yeah,
They know that
they become very good at the guessing game.
It's peaking at 5 dB, so they know they have to suppress the 2K frequency response, but they don't even know what's going on in the bass.
It's not quite as bad as it seems because they were intended to be put on the console, and so they deliberately rolled it off at 200 hertz a bit so that when you put it on the console, the bass kind of comes back a little bit. So it's not quite as bass shy as you think when you hear it on a console because it's getting the boost from being on the console.
Yeah,
Well
yeah.
said.
In a room, the room will definitely boost the bass some. But still, what I'm trying to say is, if you mastered with more of a flat speaker and a better speaker, you would, like Mike said, the Genelecs are definitely hands above what this NS10 is. I mean, the Genelecs are very flat speakers, and if you master with something like that, but just think about how many recordings weren't mastered with a good speaker. That's the most incredible part to me.
Well, like I said, it wouldn't be a problem if they would choose not to equalize to those speakers, which they
Yeah, well, the recordings are already made, Gary. That's the problem. There it is. What a beautiful response. Isn't that nice?
Wow.
It's not a factor anymore. Most people have them because they have to have them.
So, right. So, but I like the older recordings. I like to listen to older recordings. I don't want to be stuck with the new music. So my problem is a lot of the older recordings were mixed with this kind of frequency response. That's an issue. I love old rock and roll, and this is a problem to me. Look at this roll off.
Unbelievable.
That's anechoic. That's anechoic. That's not on a that's no bass boost from being on a console. Different from a room.
Yeah,
Right,
so it will boost it some. I agree, but still, there might be a dip here. We don't know.
That's
depending on the room.
That's the anechoic response curve.
So in theory, if you bought these speakers and had them in your own stereo, the recording should sound correct.
No, it's still going to sound like this.
The point is, a lot of these speakers are talked about measured anechoically. I mean, that's how they're advertised to sell. So what I'm saying is, it's always still better to get a flat response here. Yeah, the room's going to affect it, but each room that you put this in is going to have a different response.
Let me throw out.
Those weren't sold for rooms; they were sold for studios. It's still horrible, but just keep in mind that they were designed specifically to go on a console, unlike your speakers. So it's still horrible, but just keep in mind that.
On the other hand, a room has its own peaks and valleys, and every room is going to impose its own character. No room is going to give you the frequencies that is not even being produced by the speaker. I mean, you're looking at a dB difference here of 35 dB. I mean, how's a room going to recover that?
It can't. It has no bass. It has no real bass whatsoever. I'm just saying that. Just kind of keep in mind that as horrible as that looks, if you see a measurement from on a console, it'd be a little bit different than what you're looking at there, but it's still terrible.
It's terrible.
Let me throw in.
A lot of these recordings are just aggressive. That's not an accident. They're aggressive. A lot of these recordings.
Let me throw in one more wrench into the spokes. Can you imagine if we were comparing the audiograms of the engineers to see what deficits they have in their hearing and how they're mixing? And you throw that in as another variable.
That's in Toole's book too, Alan. If you read the book, he did exactly that. He showed the frequency. He showed the frequency responses of like 200 speakers in different studios, and it's all over the place. And then he did audiometrics of the recording engineers, and that's all over the place. And then you go, well, there it is, just a total mess.
You'll get a kick out of the next slide. Watch this. Bob Clearmountain's other significant claim to fame is probably that he was the first to use tissue paper over the tweeter in an attempt to dull their overbright balance. The only other time that I've seen this done is in Charlie speakers when Charlie Silver wired the horns. Bart used tissue paper over the horns, and then he walked out of the room.
By the way, was that Angel Soft or Northern?
That's a good question. You know what? You're not kidding, Jeff. They talk about different toilet tissue producing different sound. I swear to God. They had these things in every recording studio, and they had to find out a way to make them sound decent. Examining the NS10, the tissue paper phenomenon, analysis of the industry-wide practice of using tissue paper layer to reduce high-frequency output because of that 2K hump. Recording engineer, producer, magazine, Bob Hodas. He's a great guy. I love Bob Hodas. He's a really good guy. I know him. Okay, normal response, tissue paper response. Single ply, pocket pack Kleenex. Now, I swear, there's other curves that have different type of tissue paper. But actually, if you look at this is actually better than this. So they were trying to control this resonance, and that's what it was, this aggressive resonance with tissue paper. Okay, Bob Katz is an American audio mastering engineer, author of a popular book on audio mastering, which I have. It's a great book. Katz has mastered 3 Grammy Award-winning albums and 1 nominated album. This guy's awesome. He was at our club. Mike Chafee had him at his house. He came to my house. We did a listening session. He's a really good guy. We had a lot of fun. And he talks a lot about dynamic range. In music, dynamic range describes the difference between the quietest and the loudest volume of an instrument or a part or piece of music. In modern recording, this range is often limited through dynamic range compression, which allows louder volume, but can make the recording sound less exciting or live. If you go to the loudnesswars.info, you'll see a lot of the most popular recordings, the dynamic ranges are listed. And you better believe that the better dynamic ranges usually, now I say usually, indicate for a better sounding CD or album. Because the dynamic range adds life to the music. The loudness wars. Here's the loudness wars, okay? So the audible consequence that has been that the volume of pop, rock, and other music recorded and released on commercial CDs has risen steadily since the late 1980s, with a corresponding reduction in dynamics, and in many cases, a trend towards a more aggressive and fatiguing sound character, all in attempts to make each track as loud or louder than the perceived competition. The problem is that sells. The artist wants a loud track, but then you lose the dynamic range. Then you lose the action in the music. It's bewildering to think that the audio format that offered the greatest dynamic range potential ever made available to the consumers now routinely used to store music deliberately processed with the least possible dynamic range in the history of recorded music. Mike, do you have any comment?
No.
Okay.
But John, I have a question. What does that mean, that last sentence you just read? When he said, I lost it. To routine.
Okay. So they're trying to record music a lot for cars. Okay.
Right, right.
So
But
the louder the average is in the recording, they clip off the top of it and there's less dynamic range. So then the music starts to not have peaks at all and it becomes very boring.
No, I understand that part, but I don't understand the part where he says to think that the audio format that offered the greatest dynamic range potential. What is the audio format that he's talking about?
Yes, we now have 24-bit 96 kilohertz, which is way more dynamic range than you could possibly have, or higher than even that than you could have with analog recordings back in. So now we have huge dynamic range recording and storage capability, and now the tracks that are being played are compressed like crazy. You know, you hear the pop music, and there's zero dynamic range. So he's just saying the irony that we now have the most dynamic range capability we've ever had to record, and yet ironically what's coming out the door of recording shooters is highly compressed pop.
Right, but I don't think we've really adopted the 96K format. I mean, we're still stuck in the 44.1K format.
For distribution, for almost everything was recorded at 2496, Joe. Almost everything these days is recorded, but for distribution, 1644 is still in excess of hearing and stereo systems.
Okay,
your
so
stereo system cannot.
This was a little bit of my disagreement with Bob Katz at that meeting. So the recording industry have adopted the 24-bit 96K format as the standard of recording. I mean, we didn't adopt that. It seems like the recording industry adopted PCM as the standard recording. Okay, so my a little bit disagreement with Bob Katz was that I preferred the DSD format because it just sounds better to me, but they are entrenched in a PCM format that we feel that might not be the best format for recording. Might not be the ultimate format.
A very simple answer to that is you can't mix with DSD.
I understand that.
You have to convert it to PCM to do all mixing and all mastering, and then reconvert it back for distribution. So that's why they use 2496.
You know what's amazing? Depending on how it's remastered, though, there's a lot of DSDs that I have that the 44K sounds way better than the DSD. It's how it starts too.
Without a doubt.
That alternate one, if you have alternate one, it was recorded like in the 60s or 50s or something. It's got all these I forgot who it has on. It's got who does it have? Dizzy Gillespie and all these talented musicians. It is one of the best horn recordings, bar none. I don't care DSD. I don't care what what format you're using. That alternate one the instruments are in the room. It's amazing what they did. Now, did they record it with a tube amplifier? Probably. Did they record it? They recorded it in studio? Yeah. They didn't do a lot of mixing on it. And it sounds fabulous. Unbelievable.
Let's be sure and understand that this does not mean that you cannot use compression. You must use compression. You must tailor your dynamic range to the medium that you're transmitting it in. You must optimize it. And as far as those recordings, John, those were made by cats that played every day. By the engineers who were working in the same rooms every day, who were really fucking good at what they did.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of good engineers out there, but the problem is there's a lot of bad ones too. That's the issue.
Compression is not inherently a bad thing. I think it's just been, with this loudness wars and everything, it's just been overused and abused.
Well, luckily that's changing because of Apple.
Remaster does not mean better. We're cutting off dynamic peaks in the music. This is ZZ Top, Sharp Dressed Man. And there's one that's remastered. Look at the remastered here.
God.
Look at the remastered. It's clipping off the top of this. This is the original. That's the remastered. Look at this. You're losing all this dynamic range. Same thing here. 1980, this is original. Remastered 2001, worse. Remastered 2005, worse. Deluxe 2011, not as bad as these. More dynamics, more dynamic range. But still, to me, the original is best one is this one. Any questions about this? I think it's a pretty interesting slide. Everyone thinks that if they remaster something, it's going to be better. A lot of times, the old recordings, like a Deep Purple, I have Deep Purple Machine Head that came out of '72. It's way better than a lot of the other. I have like maybe 5 or 6 versions of it, and the best one, the best sounding one, is the one that came out of the '70s.
Yeah, the idea behind that whole loudness wars was to make the recording just inherently sound louder on your stereo without turning up your volume.
Actually, you mean on the radio is what they wanted it to sound louder.
Right. That
the louder sound is what people are going to stick with on the dial.
You're right. And that's, they would compete by making their music sound louder than the other stations.
And they're already doing that in the transmitter with an Orban Optimide. So they're compressing the compressed.
It's also done partly because the more compression you have, like in those top waveforms, people can turn it down more, like in elevator music or something, and still hear all the music.
Yes.
But like if you take a recording, what is that one recording everyone loves? It's Masekela, Hugh Masekela.
Oh, Hope.
Yeah, the I forget which one it is, but anyways, it starts out so low, you have to turn the volume up a lot. But the dynamics in that thing are so incredible and so lifelike because it has just incredible dynamic range. That's one reason why all the speaker companies at one point, when you went to a show, had that recording on.
Yeah, you're talking about Stimela on the
Stimela.
album.
Yes, Jeff. Okay, now this guy is one of my heroes. I love this guy. If you get a chance, look him up on YouTube. His name's Francis Rumsey. I've read his whole book, Spatial Audio. It's absolutely interesting. It's not a cheap book, so you don't have to buy the book. Just watch the YouTube video. Very interesting. He explores the principles and practical considerations of spatial sound recording and reproduction. Particular efforts given increasing important multi-channel surround sound and 3D audio, including binaural approaches, but he doesn't ignore stereo. That's why I like him. He doesn't ignore, he said you can get stereo to sound really good. So he's kind of got an open book on this, on the different formats. This guy's written more papers, though. He's a fellow of the Audio Engineering Society and a regular contributor to AES. I think I have probably 30 or 40 of his papers downloaded, and I have his book also. But anyways, he's very good. So
is he a recording engineer? Does he have any recordings that he mastered?
I don't know. I have to look that up. But he knows all about recording. So
no, he's sort of a technology writer, Alan. He doesn't do any recording, but he's been following recording technology, spatial audio, all that sort of thing. I don't think he's actually a degreed engineer. He's just a sort of a tech writer who likes to compile all the latest research and talk about it in slides and presentations.
And he's a scholar who speaks in a way that you can understand what he's saying.
Yes.
Are there any particular recordings he recommends that illustrate what he's writing about?
I don't know if he really goes into recordings. I haven't heard any.
It's more the technology, Alan. He's saying this is the technology that can be used for realistic reproduction, stereo being the bottom, of course, and then up from there. But he, just like John says, he doesn't ignore stereo, because there are AES tests where they tested a whole bunch of channels, like 20 or 30 channels versus stereo. And in some cases, the stereo presentation was actually preferred.
Right.
So he talks about all that sort of thing. And of course, how to take stereo, which is what 99.9% of recordings are, and turn it into something even better than two channels, which is what yours truly does.
That's some key.
Okay, so here he is. Only 5% of the recordings. Now, I actually translated this from the video because this was not written. So this was a pain in the butt, but it was so good that I had to translate it onto here. Only 5% of the recordings that are sold on the commercial market are actually recordings where there is any sort of natural environment reproduced. Very few recordings that we listen to on a day-to-day basis are actually recordings of natural spaces that are attempting to give you a concert hall-like experience. Very few. In the home, essentially classical music is where you try to recreate some semblance of a natural acoustical space in the reproduction environment. And even the most classical recording engineers would admit that they don't actually attempt to reproduce natural acoustics in the listening room, because mostly that is not what people want. The commercial classical music recording sound often involves quite a lot of close microphones. So they don't get a hall effect. They don't get reverberation. So then they have to add reverberation later. I like a mixed classical. If you could actually record from the kind of the middle front of the hall would be great. Then you get all that luscious reverb. So they have to add it because it's close milk. So their recordings are essentially manufactured for a commercial audience to succeed on a relatively small number of channels. And this is even true of 5-channel recordings. And here's more, and this is important too. There are purists around, but that is very small part. So check this out with these recordings. Small part of the commercial music market. 95% of what people tend to listen to is really manufactured in the studio, like we were talking about with the different tracks, by means of artificial panning effects. So most of what we hear is some sort of amplitude panning between 2 or more channels, and the ubiquitous lexicon or whatever form of effects takes your fancy. Under these circumstances, there are really no natural environment to reproduce whatsoever. So the aim, if there is one, of such reproduction is probably to try to convert what this guy hears in the recording studio as accurately as possible to the listener at home. If you sit at home, you might be thinking of things more in terms of, does it sound like the concert hall where I heard Shostakovich Symphony or whatever? I would argue that most listeners don't have any idea of what the original sound should have sounded like. They simply want it to sound nice. Any questions about this? This is pretty. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the ultimate goal is, do you enjoy it or not? I've been to some concerts where the acoustics were bad. You wouldn't want it to sound like that in your home.
I absolutely agree, but I just want to. I'm trying to point out how much control the engineer has on a piece that you think that you're trying to save this pristine recording, which what I'm trying to say is 95% is fake ambience of these recordings, including classical. That's all I'm trying to say is, if you're afraid to find out exactly what you're saying, if you're afraid to find out what you like at home and set it up for what you like, instead of, I've seen rooms set up to absorb all the frequency that the speakers don't play, so they can have a completely dead room because they think they're getting what's on the recording, this pristine recording. The problem is, it's not a pristine recording.
And John, you know, in that same light, there's a lot of assumptions made here that this is what the people want to hear and this is what they like. Now they're selling the product, so maybe they're right. Maybe that's the product that's selling. I don't know, but it looks like there's a lot of assumptions that they.
There is a lot, Joe. You're right. There is a lot of assumptions. I'm just telling you that I hear these people say, "Oh my God, I can't do this. I can't do this with my stereo because I can't use a tone control because man, oh man, that's going to mess me up. It's going to take what that recording was originally." My point being is, it wasn't that great. This is 95% of the recordings.
Mm-hmm.
So here we go. This is by J.J. French. This is kind of comical, actually. This is fun. The closest you will ever get to the sound of an instrument or voice actually recorded is what the producer and engineer hear at the recording console through monitor speakers that they're listening to. It is technically impossible to get any closer, with very rare exceptions being direct-to-disc recordings. This means 99% of all recorded music goes through the following process. Watch this. First, an engineer has to find a microphone with all the inherent characteristics and limitations to put in front of the instrument amplifier vocalist. Then that sound runs through some pretty crappy, very long cables into a control room. Now, I went into that the studio that AJ was talking about. I forget his name too. It'll pop in my head as soon as I get off of here. But anyways,
it's Greg, and it's Fat Sound.
Yes.
Fat Planet.
Yes.
Fat Planet. Greg.
He showed me what they was running. Little, maybe 28 gauge wires all over the studio. All over the studio. So now we're trying to add these huge, humongous cables that are $10,000 a pair, and it was recorded on these little tiny wires.
It gets even funnier if you ever see a mixing console inside of it. The quality of the components and the wiring inside there, it's hysterical. That's why I laugh about the fancy cable folks. If you ever see inside of that mixing console, you would die to see the quality of the wire and the 1 cent resistors and the 1 cent capacitors and all that sort of thing. It's absolute garbage in there, and yet it sounds fine.
Here it is. Then it passes through a mixing console. There's all sorts of crappy wire, dozens of faders, tone controls, equalizers, limiters, and compressors. Oh, we don't like DSP. We're not going to let DSP touch my stereo. Oh, I got this 2-channel, $300,000 stereo that I'm going to just plant myself in the middle, and I'm going to absorb all the sound off of the walls so that I can see what that recording is. But the problem is you are DSPing it already, and you don't even realize it. Then the sound passes through an amplifier, and then mostly, but not always, cheap lamp cord speaker wire from a hardware store, which is connected to some of the worst sounding speakers. We already talked about that. These speakers are considered excruciatingly revealing for the purpose of deep analysis. And then the producer finally hears the sound and decides what combination of tones, after lots of tweaks and processing, sounds the most authentic to them. Once the recording portion is finished, the tape or hard drive is mixed yet through another set of gear manned by more engineers and mixer specialists. Yet another set of people that think what they hear is what you should hear, who then can make more decisions using another set of limiters, compressors, and equalizers. So it's EQ'd like multiple times. And we're trying to save that pristine recording. I'm not. I'll alter it. It doesn't bother me.
There's another factor. There's another factor here that Bob Katz went over too. There's amplifiers in the studio room that are microphoned, like certain Fender amplifiers that have become the standard in the industry. So they want this rock recording to sound like you're at a concert. So they actually have these Fender amplifiers, these small Fender amplifiers with Fender reverb, with the spring reverb, and then they mic those amplifiers even before the miking process.
Wow. After that, the mixed finished tape or hard drive is sent to the mastering lab. where another bunch of people, yet with another set of compressors, limiters, and EQs, have to decide if the music sounds uniform in both volume and tone. Then, for vinyl, the RIAA curve has to be added in to make sure that the bass is cut down as the recording nears the end groove so that the needle does not jump out of the groove. Many people make decisions about what they think sounds correct. The fact that some recordings sound amazing is a happy confluence of circumstances, given all the ways the final recording could get screwed up due to all these factors just mentioned. I think that is one of the most incredible slides, just mind-blowing. The case for tone controls. You don't have to talk to me about tone controls. Here's the thing. I don't overuse it. I don't go in there and sit there. I mean, not to mention anyone, Jerry. Jerry likes to use all his tone controls and makes a nice smile, and he's boosting this and boost. I don't do that. But there are certain recordings. I have 4 filters, and there are certain recordings that sound better, and there's no doubt about it. I can have you in my room, and I'll put the song on, and then I'll put it on with the filter on because I'm listening to a sound that's rolled off, okay? And a little high-end tone, little high-end frequency to it, and you will tell me, I don't want to listen to that other recording that you just played, that flat recording, because it's really not flat in the room. I want you to put on the filter that I just put on, and it's just like night and day. So this is Bill Levens. He says, I previously mounted more on the death of tone in modern audio gear, written about wood in audio gear. As far as I'm concerned, we're talking about 2 sides of the same coin. There was a time when every radio and preamp had some type of tone control that could be used to compensate for deficiencies in recording, or to a certain extent the room, or even just or even adjust the sound to match personal tastes. There's nothing wrong with personal taste, especially when you have recordings that are all the way across the board. I know Mike Chafee does his system to personal taste. I do my system to personal taste. AJ does his system to true. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong. If your goal is to hear the pristine recording, which really doesn't exist, you'll end up listening to maybe 20, 30% of your music because the other stuff just doesn't sound good. Or just to crank up the bass when the thunder sheets are going in the rinse cycle. When you look at Much Love Audio Research SP3 shown above, what do you see? Tone controls, not just the usual treble and bass, but a contour control, which alters the slope of the bass and treble controls. They were useful. Not every recording's perfect. In fact, very few are. And those tone controls were particularly useful in the ear-bleeding days of early CDs. That's what we talked about. And certain moving coil cartridges. Couple more slides and we're done. Tone controls. So whatever happened to tone controls? This is Paul McGowan. You know, the bass and treble boost controls that used to adjourn just about every 1950 and 1960 era preamplifier. They fell out of fashion in the 1970s because purists didn't want them. I have an idea.
John,
Yes.
1 second. I just want to comment on that. It's
Sure.
When you say purists, you can mean a lot of different things. The problem with analog tone controls and equalizing in the analog domain, as opposed to what you do in the equalizing in digital domain, is you always take away from the transparency when you do any kind of equalizing in analog domain. And that's
Okay, but I'm just going to tell you, I'll tell you this. If you try it and you add a little bit of treble, you could say it messes with the phase. You could say this, you could say that. I'm telling you that some recordings need treble boost, and they sound better with treble boost. There's no doubt about it. Some recordings need a little more bass, and they sound better with a little more bass. I mean, I've messed with this for years. I mean, I'm not just saying this because, you know, it's just not
using what recordings, Jeff? What recordings what recordings do those bass and treble controls automatically take away the transparency from?
Well,
Name some recordings. Name some recordings that that bass and treble control takes away transparency from if it's analog.
off the top of my head, I can't think of anything specific, but in general, I'm talking about.
Right. Every single one of those recordings used analog bass and treble controls, and a lot more. That was the whole point of John showing us the mixing console. Those are all analog. Those are analog bass and treble and mid range and lower mid range and upper. That's all been tweaked, and here you have a pristine recording. How did that happen?
Well, that may be like he said in the slide. A lot of coincidences end up making for a pristine recording. But in general, the less processing that's done of any kind leads to more transparency.
I agree. The problem is the recordings are processed. 95% of the recordings are processed already. So you kind of have to
it's been through a bass and treble control 1,000,000 times in the recording studio.
Yeah.
Which, according to you, if they're analog, will take away transparency. So the end product should be absolute garbage with zero transparency.
Well,
Yet here you are using that recording of utmost transparency and saying, well, I hear the bass and treble control taking away the transparency.
Well, I'm not saying necessarily. Maybe that recording was unbelievably phenomenal before they started to fuck with it. You know, I mean, you really don't know.
It's too late at that point. It's already been through. You have it in your hand. It's already been through the mixing console and 1,000,000 bass and treble analog controls, doing all kinds of things, robbing the transparency. So you should have zero transparency by the time it hits your hands.
Well, that's not necessary. First of all, going from maximum to zero, you know, that'd be like an automotive analogy saying, well, if you put mufflers on the car, if they're going to be so restrictive that the car is not going to be able to accelerate at all. Now, of course,
you said that having a bass and treble control on your preamp, if it's analog, always takes away transparency. So if that is the case, then 1,000,000 bass and treble controls on a mixing board should just annihilate any recording that you end up with at home. Because it's been through analog bass and treble controls in the studio 1,000,000 times.
I mean, you're going from one extreme to the other. The next line in John's tone controls talks about the Mark Levinson's cello. Now, Mike Chafee actually has that and can talk about that from his own experience.
Okay,
Yeah,
let me.
I was going to say that
Mike.
the most important thing about equalizers, know what they are, what you have, use them judiciously, and practice.
But if it's worth the practice, then it's worth making a recording sound better.
Oh my God, yes.
I've been to your house, Mike, and I know how we sit there and listen to those recordings, and all of a sudden we'll tweak it a little bit, and boy, oh boy, that recording comes out. It's amazing because it wasn't.
Time change makes a big difference.
It needed to be re-engineered.
Hey, I think y'all are talking about two different things. You're talking about how something sounds tonally versus taking away the transparency. Every time I put a DSP in my system, it takes away the transparency without touching the controls to control the frequency.
That's
Every
not
time
my experience.
That's taking away the transparency. No, it may sound better, to boost the bass or do whatever you're going to do with it. I don't think anybody's arguing that tonally they can help your system or this, that, and the other thing. The point is, when it's flat, you put it in and you lose transparency. You take it out and you have more transparency. I think that's all we're talking about.
Well, to AJ's point, he asked me recordings. In general, and everybody's going to say, well, it's great. They're recorded well, but it's mediocre music. That may be true. But the Maple Shade recordings as a whole are incredibly transparent. Now, whether you like the music or not, that's a separate entity. But they are really, they have minimalistic compression. In fact, I don't think, what's his name? The guy in, I forget his name. In
Pierre something, yeah.
What, sorry?
Pierre something.
Yeah, Pierre Spray, right, S-P-R-E-Y.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
He, you know, has no compression, no equalizing, no nothing. And his stuff, as far as the transparency is concerned, is up there with the very, very best.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But the problem is, then you're stuck with the 30 recordings that you'll listen to, because the other ones, there's 95%. Maple Shade's excellent. I have Maple Shade here. I listen to them all the time. It's too bad that Maple Shade didn't make across the board, because across the board, especially with the loudness wars and everything like that, across the board, the recordings are altered. You just saw the slide how much they're altered. I'm talking about just the average recording. So there's nothing wrong to want to alter that recording a little bit to make you want to listen to it.
And with the coronavirus and all these artists performing in their homes. Now, I don't know if anybody here watches much TV, probably not, but all the artists that go and perform on everywhere from Colbert to Fallon to Seth Meyers, when they're in their house and they have high quality condenser microphones like the Neumanns, you can hear the difference in transparency even on the television. And, you know, whether it goes through 14 billion pots and whatever on the, you know, after the microphone, it still sounds better. Now, I'm not saying, AJ, that it goes from like incredibly fantastic to zero, you know, transparency if they use, you know, tremendous amount of processing, but there is a difference. Maybe it's logarithmic. I don't know how you want to say, but it's not like, you know, no transparency at all.
But the issue
all these things are testable. If somebody says that a tone control, an analog tone control, robs transparency, well, I can test that, insert it in the system, do a blind test, and see if it's real or in their imagination. Same thing with DSP. If you think that putting a DSP in the system,
Yeah, right. Like Mike just said, everything has a trade-off. We've done this in his system. He has the ability to do all these things. And while we can't A/B it, you know, instantaneously, we can do like a close approximation, and he'll tell you that the transparency changes. But he gets sometimes the trade-off is better tonality, you know, in terms of the voice or whatever he's trying to do. So it's a trade-off.
All right, here's the thing. If you want to forget all these fancy words. If you want to make the recording sound more pleasurable to you, then you can use, if you want, you can use a bass and treble control. And it's not like a vampire, like with a cross. It's not like that. I mean, these people get labeled as like incredible, like, whatever you want to call it. I don't know.
heretics.
Yeah, heretics. That's what I'm trying to say.
But you know, John, there is different levels of tone controls that work as opposed to some inferior tone controls. I remember in the days where all the magazines, Stereo Review, High Fidelity, were touting the Sound Craftsman equalizer, okay? And then they went to a parametric equalizer because they felt they had more control over the bandwidth and that kind of deal. But everybody in the 70s owned so did I, a Sound Craftsman equalizer, okay? And there were certain things that the equalizer did rob from the recordings. There were certain qualities it did rob from the recordings. On the other hand, I was in a New York audio show with Mark Levinson and heard the audio palette, which is a bullet here on your thing here. And the audio palette was such a high, first of all, I think it was $10,000 back in the 70s, but it really gave you a nice, clear rendition of a different tonality. It really was a very high quality tone control, and it was fantastic. And I remember hearing it, and it's very easily distinguishable. I mean, all we have to decide on is the end product at this point. That's all we have as audiophiles. We can't control the rest of the chain that goes along. So we just We just change what we have influence over to change.
Right. Absolutely, Joe.
And
So that means good tone control, even analog ones, are possible. And so the whole thing about, well, tone controls are bad is just because you have a bad example or 10 bad examples, but then you just said there's a good example. So that means that it is possible to have transparent, if you want to call it that, tone controls in both analog and digital domain. It's just that you can name bad ones and you can name good ones.
It's like anything else in audio. If you're looking to spend the money,
and actually do it yourself and experience it yourself, both in the analog and the digital domain. And I also have a Weiss compressor de-esser. I got a lot of external gear. If you want to come and play with it, you're welcome to.
And there's another thing too. It's when they took away the tone controls. I think it was, who was it? The first one that took away the tone control. I think it was Mark Levinson. And everyone followed after that, okay? If you're not going to have tone controls on your system, and the only way you could improve the system is to upgrade it, then they're going to make a lot more money on you because you can take a tone control, make it sound what you want to hear, but now you have to trade in your amp, your wires, and there's this wheel that they get on, this hamster wheel, and they constantly regurgitate gear. Ask Mike Bovaird, he'll tell you. So,
another circle of confusion.
Yes, another circle of confusion. Let me finish.
Got a question.
They fell out of fashion in the 70s because purists didn't want them. The analog audio path must be absolutely pure. They fell back into fashion in the 90s when Mark Levinson cello introduced the audio palette designed by Dick Berwin, a multi-thousand dollar tone control with separate power supply. It was deemed high-end and desirable, but too expensive for most of us. 20 years later, they've reappeared in almost every home theater processor and receiver on the market, but not in two-channel. What's interesting here is
Mike Chafee is using that right as you speak right now.
I know he is. What's interesting here is two things. The apparent 20-year on again off again cycle, and that cycle hasn't yet repeated itself in two-channel. A vast majority of high-end audio, now digital, the old concerns of mucking up the analog signal with an EQ circuits are gone, while the value of tone controls making up for poor recordings and deficiencies in the room, loudspeaker never went away. Now that we can't add them without any worry of compromising the audio chain, it has me wondering when they will become the rage once again. I would say never, because like we said a couple minutes ago, you can make a lot more money trading in gear trying to change your sound that you can using tone controls. Now, this is the shit, man. Shit audio. It's called the Loci. Okay. It's $149. I'm not telling you should. First of all, if you love the music and you listen to 80% of your music collection and you enjoy it, even though the recordings suck in a lot of cases, then don't do this. I'm not telling you to do this. I'm telling you this is an option just to see what the hell it'll do. So this is, I love the Shit Audio website. It's very entertaining. They say, yes, this is a tone control in equalizer. And yeah, we know the tone controls have kind of fallen off the planet for the last few decades, but now we think it's time for them to come back in a new super high fidelity, low noise, single discrete gain stage and LC filtering kind of way. In English, that means it's exceptionally quiet, transparent, great sounding.
I've got a question, John.
Hold on, I'm almost done. Let me just rest my voice after this slide. But why EQ? Because we live in an imperfect world, and because individuals have individual preferences. Nobody can say their speakers or headphones are ruler flat. Nobody can say that all the recordings are audiophile quality. We just learned that. That's why I spent time on this slideshow to show you this. Loci provides a way to adjust for imperfect systems and imperfect recordings. But this is true. Is this true for original recording? Is this what the artist intended? Oh my God, it's what the engineer intended, by the way. It's not the artist. If it sounds good to you, who cares? Who cares? If it sounds good, if it's pleasurable and it makes you listen to more of your music, collection, then who cares? And in
If
my
you
case,
connect them- if you connect
well,
them
if I
basically
do
to the
get it,
music.
I can bypass it. Yes, there was a switch on the front to completely bypass the tone control stage. And as in a relay connects the input and output directly. No active devices in the signal path at all. I'm not telling you to buy this thing, but I'm just telling you, I really feel that you will listen to more of your recordings if you have this as one of your like a switchblade. You need all these different blades.
I highly recommend that you use this because you can do Cuban engineering, which is I twist the knob till the shit sounds good.
That's right, Mike. Any other questions? Any other slides you want me to go back to?
John, by the way, it's SCHIIT.
Oh, excuse me. I don't think they care if people buy this. I don't care what. I think that's all they care about. But thanks, Jeff. Any other questions about any slide you want me to go back to, or are we good?
I think Gary had a question.
Well,
Okay,
I just want
Gary.
to know, how are you judging this transparency and improvement and shit audio equalizers and things? How do you judge that?
It's $149. You have to figure it out yourself. I can't tell you that.
Well, you're going to say just by listening, right?
No,
That's
I'm talking
right.
about that a lot of these recordings have low bass and could use a bass boost, or the treble is rolled off. Many recordings are like this, and if you
Okay,
want to
but
just
then-
sit there with your 2-channel and not be able to alter that, and then you might not want to listen to the recording. I'm just giving you another alternate method to maybe listen to more of your music collection. That's all I'm doing. If you don't want to do that, it's not a problem.
Well, what usually happens is you put a smile on your equalizer and it sounds better to you because it has more lows and more highs. But I thought it was obvious to most people that what you want to do is have an analyzer on your system. And whether you equalize at the listening seat or at the speaker, we can argue about later, AJ. But, you know, I just got this new receiver, and it has its own internal EQ system where you put the listening mic at the listening position, and it goes through all these automated things, and then you try to see if it sounds better. It had problems. It's not as good as the Behringers that I used to use, so I might have to go back to that.
Sure.
But my point is you should analyze it somehow. Now, AJ told me about a little microphone that you can stick in your iPhone that it's called the Dayton Audio IMM6. And then you get a file along with it where they have calibrated the damn thing. And you can put that file into your phone to make it a perfectly flat measurement microphone. And you get a graph if you have audio tools right on your phone there, and you can test what you have done with that. And that's a really neat thing because it's so convenient. You can let the damn receiver do what it wants to your sound and then put some pink noise through it and see what you've done. And if it's pretty flat, then you can probably be pretty happy with it. Anything else you do to it by ear is just a matter of taste. AJ?
I want to say years ago I had posted something on Meetup on the forum about that microphone. You can get them for Android and for iPhones. The iPhone needs a lightning adapter, but they sell them obviously, as Gary found out. And it's a great basic tool because the microphone is $20 and audio tools is maybe 10 or 15. So for
Yeah.
$30 or $35, you can get some pretty basic, good, accurate basic measurements of what your bass is doing and all that. Where Gary and I might diverge is that perceptually you don't want to extend that past 500 hertz or so. But in the low frequencies, you can certainly see. Ramshan, why are you sitting in front of a pair of avant-gardes?
Charlie's. It's Charlie's avant-gardes.
Yes.
Behind Ramshan?
Yes.
Is it like a background photo? Why am I seeing that then?
Yeah.
because I like it.
Anyway, yeah. So,
AJ, those are headphones.
I swear there's a thread on Meetup. Alan was kind of shaking his head. You remember that one, Alan? You're muted.
You're muted, Alan. You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, I remember it. Problem is, most of the modern day phones don't have the standard headphone jack, so you need another dongle to use the mic. But yes.
Yeah, lightning adapter. So.
Yeah, for Android devices, I don't know, probably USB adapter of some sort, I suspect.
Yeah, I think there's a USB to 3.5 or whatever the jack is. Yeah, I think so. But I mean, again, that's just one of many ways. It's real easy because everybody has a smartphone. And if you get this mic, you can use the internal mic of a smartphone, but it's not very accurate. This is a calibrated mic, which you get a file for. It's very accurate, actually.
To me, you don't have to measure it. You're trying to establish what a recording sounds better. You're just tipping the treble up or bass up a little bit per recording. You're not trying to get it to be, I mean, if you want to go into those measurements, that's fine. But my point is here is a tone control to improve, to make you enjoy your music collection better.
John, yeah, I have no problem with that. I think the whole purist thing, came from components more so back in the day. The more components and items and cables you have in your signal chain between your source and your speakers, the more potential you have to degrade the sound, unless the quality is really up there. But I believe that's what the whole purist thing came from, and the myth that tone controls were a bad thing, which I don't think they necessarily are, so as long as it's done quality wise.
I think that SIT device says the old-fashioned equalizers were probably more designed to shift the overall sound presentation of your room and system if you thought it was bass weak or heavy or treble, whatnot, but not to play with each individual recording, although we would play with that. It's a hassle to do that, but you can kind of permanently change the characteristics of your setup in that room using a device like that. How many of you would actually get up off your chair and change that around for each recording?
No,
never. I guess
I'm sitting in my chair.
Change it for every song multiple times.
I'm sitting in my chair, and I won't do it for each recording. But I'm just saying, what I'm saying is, if you have your bass control right in hand and you're sitting in your chair, you could easily alter it. You could put you could run a cable to the SHIT audio and keep it right by you also. It sounds crazy, but you could do that. And I mean, if it's anything to make you listen to more of the recordings that you love, that you have. I mean,
right. But that's
you'll be your own mixing engineer.
That's all analog. A lot of people now, of course, are using digital sources, and
right.
So I think Roon has its own EQ, if I'm not mistaken. I don't use Roon. If you're using a digital source, then there's absolutely no reason to have a digital EQ with presets, so you can have maybe 3 or 4 of them, and you have one that cuts the treble a little bit, or cuts the bass, or boosts the bass, or boosts the treble. In effect, a tone control. And along comes a song or a recording, and you go, wow, this thing has no bass. And you touch a button, and now it's much more enjoyable.
It's really weird. If I listen to different genres, like if I listen to rock and roll, I'll usually do the BBC dip because usually it's aggressive, and I'll usually boost the bass maybe 2 dB. Now it almost goes across the board. I'm not saying for every single recording, but rock and roll just sounds better with a little more bass.
I've got a problem that I could use the group's help on with this new receiver. I found that the bass response is the most problematic. I've got 2 subwoofers in my system, and if you use the measurements that the receiver does automatically, the bass will be boosted way too high. It'll shake everything in the room, and you won't be able to enjoy anything. So you turn it down a little and measure it again, and it seems to measure too low. I don't know.
Well, don't go by
Or
measurements.
how to fix it.
Gary, don't go by the measurements, because especially with subwoofers, you can't. You got to do it by ear. What sounds good to you is what's good.
Yeah.
Now, AJ will argue with me day and night, but the ear is the ultimate measuring device.
How about both? How about measure and ear? What was anything wrong with that?
Yeah, that's better.
The video stuff, especially movies on my new system, are the ones that offend in the base area most. They kind of they pound your room constantly if you have it too high, and that's
You might have your special effects channel turned too loud. You can control that in the receiver. That's another thing.
Or you can turn down the dynamics in your receiver, or your TV reception, whatever.
You're saying when the auto EQ is run, it still has too much bass, or I'm not quite clear what you're saying. And then when you measure it, it doesn't look high.
One of the things that the auto system does, they call it AccuEQ, is it measures the levels of all the speakers so that, you know, your front speakers and your surround speakers and your height speakers are all the same levels, so that hopefully the movie will sound the way it's supposed to. When you do that, the bass still measures way high, even with their auto EQ. And so you don't know what to do about that, why they've done it to you. And you turn it down on your subwoofers.
There's two different things going on when you do that. One is that'll get your speaker levels all the same, but your source or your processing, usually there's a setting in there where you can have low dynamic range, medium, or high. When you have it on high dynamic range, it's going to exaggerate the bass.
There's no dynamic range setting, at least not on mine.
Okay, well, I'm talking more home theater.
How are you connecting the sub? Is this possible? Are you feeding both like stereo to the sub as well as LFE? Perhaps you've got double input with the home theater mode.
It's the same signal that goes to both subs. It's like mono subwoofer, only I got two of them, so I wire it out to both of them. The receiver has two subwoofer outs, but they're both the same signal. So it's effectively monaural bass. So I don't know what's going wrong, but it's still.
Can you adjust the LFE channel separately from everything else on the receiver?
Just turn it down in the
LFE, yes.
speaker settings menu. Turn down the subwoofers.
I haven't seen that, but that's possible, yeah.
Yeah, in the speaker setup, you just like what you're saying when you go to do the tone control, the test controls. In your speaker setup, you should have a setting for volume levels of each channel. It'll do it for you automatically if you ask it to with the audio EQ, but you can do a manual setting where you set level, distance, all that stuff manually.
Right, there is, and I've done all that.
Where do you live, sir? Where do you live?
Well, one other thing is you don't have your subs in the corners of the room, do you?
One of them, but not the other. The other one, Alan came over with a fancy measurement system, and we moved the subwoofer so that the bass was more smoothed out.
Yeah,
Alan.
Yeah, that was the XTZ room analyzer we measured.
Make sure the sub's not the same distance between both walls. In other words, you don't want an equidistant in the corner. You want to offset.
Yeah, they're different, but another control that I have is where the crossover is set, and THX wants you to set it at 80 hertz, and that's okay with me. Between 80 and 100 is where I usually operate.
If your full range speakers go deep, then change that to 40 hertz. You may find that solves some of your problems.
Yes, Jeff. Tell him, Jeff. Stereo bass. Stereo bass.
That's right.
I'd like to make a suggestion. I've tuned over 300 rooms. If you want your shit to sound right, hire me.
Who's talking?
Mike Chafee, the egotist. Michael Chafee.
Oh, Michael Chafee.
Yeah, repeat that, Michael. We didn't get that. Please repeat.
I've tuned over 300 systems. If you would like, I'd be glad to come make yours as good as I can get it. There's way more to it than what you know, and it's all interactive.
Well, I'd like to get on that list.
I just want to make a general statement about tone controls, and I think this is what threw tone controls out of favor. Tone controls have three things that are determined by the manufacturer or by the designer. One is the frequency response, the frequency response that you're looking to change. The other one is the bandwidth, where that frequency response starts and ends, and the bandwidth of that frequency response. So if I want to boost the 2K, for instance, I might be boosting anywhere from 2.5K to 1.5K. Okay. Now,
yeah, that's good observation.
Am I now equalizing them up and down in regards to, is it a flat that I'm doing the whole bandwidth, or is now that bandwidth curved? Am I peaking out 2K and at 3 dB raised, for instance, but 1.5K, I'm only raising 1 dB. So now I'm leaving what I want to do to my system up to the designer of the equalizer or the box that's done.
That's very true.
Also, the dB range we have to take into account. Let me just finish, John. I'll let you talk. Now there's the dB range. Now, if you look at that shit, Loki, you'll see that all depending on the frequency, they give you some higher dB range, let's say for the bass and treble, but for the mid-range, they restrict your dB range to 6 dB. They feel you might not need 12 dB of boost in that particular frequency response. So I think, and that's why the parametric equalizer came out that allowed you to control the bandwidth and really zero in on the frequencies that you wanted to zero in on, and then control the dB range, either minus dB or plus dB, that you wanted to select. And I think a lot of what we say about losing transparency has to do with those decisions that are made for you when you just say, I'm going to plop something called a tone control down in my system, and I'm going to have full control. Yeah, you'll have a little more control, but then you're relinquishing that control to how that device is designed.
I absolutely agree. And I have parametric digital, all digital, parametric equalizers and all that stuff you're talking about, but I didn't want to present it to the club because, I mean, if you want to go parametric, you can do that.
We're talking two different things.
I wanted to keep
You're talking about a narrow correction, which would be like a speaker problem, versus having bass and treble controls for a bright or dull recording. It's two different things altogether. If you want very precise cut, you have a 2K peak like that Yamaha NS10, a tone control isn't going to help, but parametric EQ or a DSP EQ can surgically remove that peak.
That's right.
That's not the same thing as having a bass and treble control for a recording that's bright or a recording that has no bass. So
or a 30-band equalizer
are
like
just
the
generalized fixes for recordings. If you need very specific stuff, a bass and treble control isn't going to help.
Well, I have to disagree with you on one point. I think they're exactly the same thing, but I think a bass and treble control has a very wide bandwidth. And I think they're really exactly the same thing, except with different characteristics. A bass and control might have a 3,000 hertz bandwidth, for instance. It might go from 15K to 18K, for instance, and you don't have control over it. That's what somebody decided that treble control should be. But a parametric.
And once again, it's the treble and bass control that were typically on receivers and integrated aspect. They weren't to fix a peak at 2 kilohertz. It was because recordings were dull, recordings were bright, your room might be a bit bassy. So you're just kind of generally fixing the problem because they couldn't put 80 channel DSP EQ in the setting because they didn't have it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about loudness controls. Does everybody remember what loudness button was on the old receivers? They made
the Fletcher-Munston loudness curve they used. Yamaha receivers had those in particular.
They were all receivers. My Sansui 8080 was my first receiver, had a loudness control that allowed you to, it allowed you supposedly to listen at lower levels, because at lower levels you're going to lose treble and you're going to lose bass. So
right.
they restore that.
You had the button one, which was just you press the button and the loudness is in. You press the button, the loudness is out.
Right.
Now,
And then
how
you
many
had
people?
Yamaha, which actually had a variable loudness. That was
how many-
Yamaha's claim to fame.
how many
was
people
that
bu-
it was variable?
How many people by a show of hands use those? I used them. I'll tell you that much. I used it. Yep.
Sometimes.
My receiver
I
has
used it when
that.
I had it, yeah.
The receiver has that. They call it night mode. And it's for if you want to turn the sound down more, you can still understand voice and everything.
I had it in several products, but I never used it because I never turned down.
You know, the purpose of the night mode in those, probably more so in home theater, is it prevents the bass from getting really loud, you know, in those action scenes where they want to, you know, have a lot of bass.
Yeah, it reduces the dynamic range actually, not the frequencies. I think the night mode is to reduce the dynamic range so that the loud sounds don't get so loud. The low sounds also don't get too low. So they boost the low ones up and then cuts the loud ones down, keeps
That's
the amplitude
compression.
within
It
the
just adds compression.
Compression.
yeah,
Right.
it's compression. Yeah.
Exactly right.
I'll try turning that down. Yeah.
Now we should take another row of hands. How many people who use the loudness control ever turned it off? That's the next thing. Now, as audiophiles, we say, oh, of course we turned it off. But I think they were abused. I think when people pressed the loudness control, they said, wow, the system sounds so much more dynamic. Look at all that great bass I'm getting. I didn't even know my speakers could do that. And once that loudness button went in, it stayed in forever.
Yeah, you're right. And that's the thing. You have to have self-control. It's just like getting a subwoofer and cranking it up because, man, you got all this bass, but then it brings attention to itself. It can sound like crap. So you're right. You have to it's almost like a tool you have to learn how to use.
It's the rent-a-car effect. You ever rent a car and you get in there and the bass control is always, it's like plus 10. It's like, what are they listening to? Well,
That's great.
So true.
So
Quick
I've got a
question, David.
question.
Yeah.
Who is going to make any changes to the way they listen to music or their system based upon John's presentation today, which was excellent, John. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, John.
Well, I'm going to plug my, I've got a Waddy SAS CD player, and it works as a preamp also, so I can plug it directly into the amplifier. And when I do that, it's very transparent. I'm going to try that again.
Sounds
I
good.
mean, that's kind of the whole purist idea. But I've got various components, so I swap them around time to time just to.
How about how many people have computer audio right now that listen to computer audio? Okay, so a lot of people.
Who doesn't?
You could even try it, like AJ said, through J-River or whatever you have. There's a little bit of a treble. In fact, it's more than treble control. If you're listening to digital, now analog, forget about it. You can't do it with analog. But for digital, you could do it easily. And I think the J-River is like maybe a 16-band EQ, which is pretty decent. You can control the sound of it.
Windows Media Player, which if you have a Windows computer and if you use Windows Media Player, that has an equalizer, and you can get the upgrade to like a 31 band just using Windows Media Player on the computer, unless you use an Apple or a Macintosh, whatever. Windows Media Player has a EQ. Foobar, which I use, which is free, a software player, that has a 31 band EQ. So there's really no reason to not use it if you're streaming or using digital sources.
Why would a source have an EQ control?
For what we've just been all talking about, the room, the recordings, your taste. I mean, you could have high frequency hearing loss, so you want to add a little bit of higher, the uppermost frequencies, or
You do that at your system, not at the source.
The source feeds your system, so I'm kind of lost here.
If your computer audio, that's typically your source anyway.
And
Use your computer to do it. So.
It's better to do it there because it's better to do it in the digital domain rather than trying to do it downstream. And also it is there because it can be done easily. And so it's packaged as part of the software.
Very
right.
Yeah.
Ramchan is right. It doesn't add distortion when you do it at the source digitally.
So you're actually equalizing before your DAC, before the DAC?
Yeah.
Digitalizing the digital stream before it's converted to
correct
analog?
before it gets to the analog domain, which is AC.
Okay, so it digitalizes it equalizes it, and then it sends the equalized digital stream to your DAC.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I personally don't do it. I don't EQ it in any way. I just listen to it flat.
It's called remastering.
Yeah, exactly.
That's about it.
By the way, if everybody is interested, I want to do a presentation on using the Raspberry Pi. I don't know if you guys are interested.
That'd be great.
Yeah, let us know. We can do a Zoom presentation for that. We talked about that at one of the prior Zoom meetings about
use the
digital stuff.
Using the Raspberry Pi as a front end. So you can set it up fairly. It's not easy, but I can walk you through it. So if you're interested, you can. And I'm getting really good results. For example, it's much better than my Blue Sound Note 2i. It simply blows it away. It's dramatic. I can even demo it actually over Zoom, and I think you'll be able to make out the difference.
What software are you running? What control software are you using?
So I've done lots of experiments on that. So I have used Volumio, I've used Mood, and then I've also used different cables. I've also used different flavors of Raspberry Pi. There's a Raspberry Pi 2B, Raspberry Pi 3B, and I've also used a USB connection. I've used the SPDIF optical and coax connections. I've gone through all this permutations and combinations, and I've come up with what sounds best in my system. So it's really fun, actually, if you start doing that.
Have you tried the Logitech Music Server? Because the open source developer community is really supporting that for the Raspberry Pi products.
No, actually, no, because the Volumio and the Mood software, they're really good because they allow you to do Spotify Connect. They will allow you to do UPnP. So you put bubble UPnP, or you can put mConnect on your phone or the iPad. And then from there, you have a beautiful visual interface to all your title and everything. And it does a phenomenal job as far as I can see. And Logitech, I think it is more... maybe, for a kind of, I thought it is more like a legacy kind of a thing. I don't know. I'm not sure. I've not tried it. Yeah.
No, it offers everything. It's currently totally up to date. It seems the main market now for Logitech Music Server, which was Squeezebox Server, it's all being controlled and developed by the open source community. It's current for Qobuz, Tidal, Spotify, even Alexa and Google Home.
Okay. Yeah, then I was thinking, how do I go and actually I want to improve my front end because I just recently, I did change my amplifier now. So I got a pass int 25. So I'm really pleased with that. And I may add, subwoofers at a later date, but for now it's okay. But I want to improve the front end.
Oh, you got the pass? You did get the pass?
I got the pass int 25. Yeah.
And did you get rid of the
benchmark is still there? It's still there. Yeah.
Are you using the Tecton as your main speakers, or still swapping back and forth between the KEF?
So I pulled in the KEFs again, and then I paired it with the int 25. There is something to be said for the combination because the combination sounds really smooth. It's very nice, but the KEFs are small speakers end of the day. So you want to rock out, you can't rock out with those. You don't get that nice room energizing. You do get room energizing bass, but there's something lacking. It sounds small compared to the Tectons. Yeah.
I have a general question if I'd like to throw out and get some opinions on. Looking up preamplifiers these days, preamplifiers seem to be going the way of the dodo bird. There's very, very few preamplifiers out there. And I've experimented quite a bit with passive preamplifiers and active preamplifiers, and always came to active preamp. I never found passive amplifiers to be as dynamic as an active preamplifiers. But I think the reason why preamplifiers are going away is because they're building them into DACs. Okay, I know DAC is an active device, but now they're making DACs with volume controls. And I think a lot of that, and people are not entertaining analog all that much. So I think that's really what's the demise of the preamp is the DAC that, like the benchmark, for instance. I wanted to get a general consensus of people here. Do you feel that the DACs are doing a good job in the preamplifier arena?
Joe, what do you need to preamplify?
Voltage. You need at least 2 volts to drive your power amplifier to the maximum. You need
Right.
volts.
So it would depend on your gain structure, Joe. It would depend on exactly how much gain your amplifier needs.
Right.
I have a NAD DAC. You might have seen it at one of the audio shows or so, and it has a volume control, but there's a limit to the output voltage. So if I was using a lower sensitivity input amplifier, it might not be enough, depending on how loud you want it to go and how sensitive the speakers, the amplifier is driving, et cetera, et cetera. So it really comes down to your gain structure.
You're not driving the gain control in the digital domain, is what you're saying. Are you driving it in the analog domain?
The volume operates in the digital domain, but what comes out of the DAC is analog. And so the balanced outputs and the RCA outputs is pure analog signal going to the amplifier, and that goes up in voltage when you digitally increase the volume on the DAC. So the DAC goes beyond 0 dB. 0 dB in a DAC means it's just passing the line level signal at either 2 volts
and it's
or
already at a level that is ready for the power amplifier. The only signal that I know of that needs to be pre-amplified is a phono signal right from the cartridge.
Well, that's not true, Gary.
No, that's not true either. Yeah, it depends on what kind of gain structure you have and how loud you want it to go. So there are times when the DAC internal preamp is sufficient, and there's times when it's possible you may actually need a bit more gain, in which case you need a quote-unquote real preamp.
Well, my Wadia has a DAC and a volume control built in. I can control the volume through the DAC, the Wadia DAC system, or CD player. But fortunately, it also has a switch inside. You have to open up the panel, but you can adjust the switch inside to match the gain to your amplifier. But no, most components don't have.
I have a DCS Vivaldi, which has analog output.
I have a carry DAC that has a volume control, but when I hook it directly to my amplifier, it doesn't sound as good as when it goes through my preamp. So the preamp is equalizing something and matching impedance, but it just doesn't sound as good without the preamp.
Exactly.
Right. And that's just what I said. The gain may be just not my preamp. Say my sheet preamp has way more voltage output than my DAC. There's no way the NAD can put out as much voltage, and so there are times where it'll sound better with the preamp, and there's times when
it is not a gain situation. My DAC puts out plenty of gain. It plays much louder than I'd ever want to listen. There's plenty of juice coming out of the DAC, but it just doesn't sound as good.
Impedance matching.
Exactly, that's what I just said.
Yeah, the way, I don't know if they are today, but the way DAC volume adjustment used to be was that when you reduce the volume on a volume controlled DAC, is that it would actually cut out digital information, and that's how it reduced the volume. And the more you reduce the volume that way, the lower quality digital output you're going to get.
That's changed a lot, though. The bits, they use higher bits now. You don't lose nearly as much information. And I have another way of doing it, is that I use tube buffers that give me an extra 9 dB. These I-Fi tube buffers. So, and it also makes it sound tube-ish, if you know what I mean. So that combination works for me.
Nice. I've got another impudent question, if I may. What do you need a DAC for?
Digital?
Convert your digital to analog.
You got some source that is putting out only a digital signal and it needs to be converted to analog?
Yeah, my computer puts out a digital signal.
The digital output of your CD player, if you're using external DAC, or if you're streaming from your Apple MacBook Pro, then it's going to be a digital output and it has to go into a DAC.
Well, use the analog output. It's got a DAC built in.
It may not be a good DAC.
Whoa. What did you say? A DAC built in?
Yeah.
To what? No. You don't want to use the built-in DAC on a computer. Trust me.
AJ, help out here.
It depends. I mean, if the internal DAC on your computer is good enough, then you're fine. But most computer DACs are connected to the analog output, like a headphone jack, and those are usually horrible.
They're noisy too. You got that.
Right,
Oh,
so
they're very noisy.
It's a misunderstanding of what a DAC is. A DAC is just the thing that converts it to analog. But then once it's done, then you have to output it analog, and on a computer, that's typically a small, preamplified stage that comes out of a headphone jack.
Yeah.
And is it possible that those could be transparent? Sure, but there's also a possibility of degradation from noise, et cetera, just because it's already been converted.
Gary, the other
It'd be a
thing
good
is
double-blind test, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Gary, the analog output stage of a DAC can be critical, key. So if you're just using your computer, you're not going to have much of an analog output stage beyond that DAC chip. That's the cheap DAC chip.
Can you measure a difference?
Clearly, I think you
Price
can
of
clearly hear
DACs.
it.
Okay, AJ.
Even the most expensive DACs use like $2 chips, Alan. So the price of the DAC chip is a joke in the DAC.
Yeah.
But the expensive part is the analog output stage, not the chip.
Right. No, that's what I was saying. The analog output stage is the difference. That's what accounts for the difference.
Well,
You
And
guys are
you have
buying.
an ABX box, and so we have the potential for a whole lot of fun, especially with Ramchan getting the new amplifier. And I said that's kind of an imaginary difference. So I'll put that to the
Okay.
test. That'll be
What
a
is
very, very
amusing
funny
is that
thing
you
to,
guys are buying very expensive CD players and then buying a separate DAC.
Right.
why is that amusing?
Sometimes.
I don't find that amusing.
Because you've got a good DAC inside the player.
Well, you know what?
Well,
Not necessarily.
then you have a whole situation with ladder DACs or Sigma Delta, and which one sounds better, and even if they measure worse, which one's more musical, and you can go on and on.
They're all as flat as piss on a plate.
Whatever connects you emotionally to the music. In my case, Bob Katz came to my house like he came to John, and he told me he never heard Tidal sound so good, and now he listens to Tidal 90% of the time, and he told me explicitly, don't change a fucking thing in your system. And that's a quote. He says, this is the best sound you're gonna get in this room. He didn't say it's the best sound in the planet, just the best I'm gonna get in this room. And I'm very happy with the way things are with the VAC preamp and the VAC monoblocks. So it's all tube, except for the subwoofer.
don't lie, Jeff. Audiophiles are never happy.
I am.
We'll use Gary. When we can meet again in person, we'll have another DAC shootout, and we'll blind you, Gary, and you'll be the golden ear to determine a difference, if any.
Okay.
No, well, that makes no sense. It's got to be the person who can hear the difference, not the person who can't.
I'm 76 years old.
Whatever makes you listen and enjoy the more of your recordings is what you should do.
That's what
Tone controls.
Don is 100% right.
Well, we certainly have a lot of potential listening sessions in person that we can carry out. Been waiting a year, AJ, for you to get that double-blind device set up. Hopefully, we'll have.
Who's going to Phil's power conditioner?
You mean coronavirus? We're waiting on, not my device.
Wait a minute, double blind. You mean Ray Charles and Jose Feliciano?
No. Who's going to Phil's power conditioner shootout?
I think me, Brad, and possibly one other person. You may have just signed up. I'm not sure.
This is a
Unfortunately, I
physical.
can't.
You guys are physically going to be together, or is
Yeah.
it a Zoom?
It's a physical meeting. I chose not to go, but he is close to me. I wanted to go, but he's probably closer than anybody else in the club to me, but I chose not to go because
I'm bringing my mask.
staying home.
Just an
Because you know you're not going to hear any difference, right?
I'm going to hear a difference, no doubt.
Just an anecdote. Ronnie Ronnie, whose video is off, he apparently is in an undisclosed location and doesn't want anybody to know. We once did a little test of the one of the Pink Floyd's in surround, the 5-channel SACD that they came out.
Dark Side of the Moon.
I can't remember if it was Wish You Were Here or Dark Side, one of the two. And he, to me, because I'm deaf in my right ear, it didn't, impress me much, to quote Shania Twain. But Ronnie actually preferred the 2-channel version instead of the 5-channel surround. So
Well, I'm deaf in my left ear, so we'll sit side by side and compare notes.
that's good.
You guys only need mono systems then.
Their sweet spot is a little bit moved over.
Well, can you actually hear which speaker is on and a test signal if you just have one ear? I think so.
It's not easy. You don't have the spatialization and localization that you would get, which is why MBLs really don't do it for me.
Well, which brings up a point. Does that shit audio device have a balance control? Because that would really help.
I'd have to look at it. I don't know. I just use that as an example too. It was just something that I thought was reasonable if someone wanted to try in the system. But now that I'm thinking about it, I think it's even a better thing if you want to try it, is to try it digitally, because so many people can do that for free. You ever try a BBC dip? If anyone tried, does anyone know what the BBC dip is?
I thought it was the hump, the BBC hump. It's a upper bass hump.
No, there's a mid-range dip called the BBC dip.
Well,
it's amazing how that can work for aggressive recordings. It's a little dip about 2.5 dB from about 1 to 5K. And it's amazing how just that little thing can make these recordings sound like they should have in the first place.
If shit audio were to incorporate that, you'd now have a shit dip.
That's right.
You mean a dipshit?
A dipshit.
It's
I
coming out
thought
next
the
year.
BBC dip was a dance.
You know what? You should call them. They'll do it because that's how their humor is. The shit dip.
It's supposed to be self-depreciating humor. They're doing well. They're one of the few companies that seem to be doing really well. Actually, they've got a U.S. made product that measures and sounds good for a very reasonable price. I have their preamp and I'm fine with it.
They really got their shit together.
I heard that preamp is awesome.
Good shit. Hey,
the Frey is really nice. It's got and you could drive yourself audiophile nuts with it because it's got the tube stage, the solid state stage, and the passive stage. There you go, Joe. You have all three in one component. You can switch to your heart's content and go nuts.
Do they have a 30-day trial? Maybe
Yes.
he can try that.
yes, they do.
Yeah. By the way,
There's
Joe, I disagree. I don't think preamps are going out of style. I think there's many more to choose from. You have more options, but there's a ton of new preamps coming on the market all the time. The only reason I even have one, number one, I like having the tube hybrid stage, but also I need it for home theater bypass, which is another thing that few DACs, if any, offer.
Well, let me qualify what I said, Alan. There's very few preamplifiers under $10,000 out there. Most of the preamps out there now are $10,000 and above, and that's
Very simple solution. Buy used. It's already burned in, so it sounds better than new.
There's a competing company called Shinola, and so a good double-blind test, see if you can tell shit from Shinola.
Hey, before we wrap up and stuff, I wanted to ask if you thought maybe Bob Katz, he sounds like a really interesting guy. You think maybe he would be up to being a guest speaker at one of our meetups or meetings?
He was already.
Oh, I missed that one.
Well, Chafee could probably get him on Zoom.
Yeah, maybe we can have a Zoom session with him.
I'm gonna be at his house next week.
Well, ask him.
I'm going to be at his house next week and I will ask him.
Yes, let's wrap this up. we can continue the conversation online, and I hope you all enjoy this. I think we'll, in the meantime, continue to schedule as many of these as we can and combine them with what Colin's doing for the Sarasota group, because at this point, we're all one entity functionally on Zoom. So please, thank you, Ramchan, for your suggestion. Follow up with me on that. If anybody else would like to present or host a discussion, it doesn't have to be a formal presentation. Just lead the discussion on some topic. You can send materials in advance, YouTube video or something as a jumping off point, and take the lead, and we'll continue doing this.
John, great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Doc. Thanks for listening to what I had to say. I was just have fun with it, so appreciate
Enjoy.
it.
Really good.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks again, guys. Stay safe.
Thank you, Alan.
You guys.
Give a hand.
Take care.